Thank you, Professor Somchat. Actually, as Professor Somchat was going through his lecture, my heart sang and sang and sang on one hand. But it's a two-sided of a coin. On the other hand, we have critical academics like Professor Somchat, so there's still hope in the practice of conservation. With this, let me introduce two of our discussants for this morning panel. Our first discussant is Professor Ho Pei Ping. Professor Ho is currently the head of architecture at the National University of Singapore. Prior to the National University of Singapore, he was professor of architecture and served as the director of School of Architecture and University Dean of Students at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He received his Master of Arts in Architecture Studies and Diploma of Architecture from the University of Edinburgh and practiced architecture in Edinburgh and Singapore. Subsequently, he took up PhD research at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. He was conservation consultant, architect, and advisor to some 100-odd conservation projects in Hong Kong, ranging from PMQ, the Haw Villa, the Comics Home Base, Oil Street Art Space, Court of Final Appeal, former French Mission building to the new campus for the Chicago's University Booth School in Hong Kong. And the second discussant of this morning's session is Mr. Kelvin Ang. Mr. Ang is the Director of Conservation Department Management at the Urban Redevelopment Authority of Singapore. He obtained his graduate diploma of architecture from Bartlett School and his Masters of Science in Sustainable Heritage from the University College London. Mr. Ang has a decade of experience in both architecture and conservation planning. His department focuses on the management of conserved buildings, education, outreach, and promotion of Singapore built heritage. With that, let us welcome our two discussants and our three morning speakers on stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor, for the invitation. It's a very rare opportunity to have such a symposium organized both maybe in Hong Kong as I was previously and in Singapore to concentrate on the material. To concentrate on material as well as to discuss the regional practices. And I think from the three speakers, it's very clear that we need a very, very good education on conserving timber structure, both in Myanmar, in Thailand. And in Indonesia, when you use the indigenous methods, I think the result is much more satisfying. But I think to me, very much like looking at the tradition. I mean, Somcha, you mentioned at the end, tradition and international. I think that's something that I really like to pick up because whenever we deal with traditional materials and traditional construction methods, if we can go back to the tradition, it will always be the best way. Right? So the training of the craftsmen, the know-how in terms of materials and in terms of the construction methods, and then the actual process of carrying it out, as well as the maintenance of the structure. I think a lot of buildings, both in Mandalay or even in the palace in Bangkok, the buildings collapse because of the lack of maintenance. And I think we should recognize that in timber buildings, it requires really very constant maintenance. and every 30 years or even less in the tropic maybe. In China, it's about every 30 years minor maintenance, and maybe 50 to 60 years major, really quite major renovation. But in the tropic, maybe every 10 years, 15 years, you really need to inspect and so on. And the ritual that you see in Indonesia really helps to bring that about, because of the cyclical nature of the ritual, the festivals and so on. That brings about a renewal, and it's written into the calendar. Right. Except that now the tradition is no longer there. I mean, in Indonesia, I hope it's still maintained, that the Wi-Fi would not go to your village, and you still need to take a 3 hours walk up the mountains. If the tradition can still be maintained, I think the ritual would continue, and the maintenance of the timber structure can continue. Apart from that, I don't see any other way to keep up the traditional buildings. I think in Shuanglingsi you did a very good work in maintaining the right craftsmanship. It's the Abbott's efforts, yes. Wonderful effort to maintain the tradition, and that's the only way to go. I think I'll let Kevin carry on.
Again, well, it's really a great privilege to be here today to really hear from the experience and the practice on the ground, the region, because I think timber as a material is so under-researched. And I think, as you've all said, a part of the discussion about conservation comes from the Eurocentric approach that privileges material, whereas we are in an environment where it is beyond the material. It's the culture, it's the spirit, it's the intent. And this is the part of conservation I think we really struggle with in both education and I would say as a public servant, professional management, because public servants work best in systems that deal with the tangibles. And how do we deal with the intangibles of the spirit, the culture, the community? I think is one takeaway that I've had from this morning. And the point about the need to build the right institutions, the ability to sustain the living cultures, which is then tied to the spiritual development or spiritual sustenance of the community. How do we bring all this together? And I think at most the public servant can do his or her duty in having the right institutions, but that is insufficient without the role of the community or the nation, talking about culture and spirit. So bringing all three together, I think, is most critical in the issue of conservation in Asia, be it timber or beyond, because we're dealing with material, immaterial. And my thought has been from maybe the experience of shared by the three of you, is that the role of ritual, the role of tradition, I would say is beyond ritual tradition of the outcome or maintenance. There's also an aspect about building and sustaining communities that live around these buildings. The building is meaningful insofar the community feels that it's important for them, and then they will find a way of having the skills and the resources to maintain, or where necessary, to rebuild or to repair. So this part is, I think, is a great takeaway, and I thought something we should all think about. How do we deal with the community? Okay, that's the wrong word. How do we, as a public service, facilitate the communities to continue to make meaning and to make use of these buildings in the right way? These are some of the thoughts I have at the moment.
So maybe I'll just take the privilege of the convener to ask our speakers some questions. We'll start the ball rolling before we open the floor up for questions. Right. The idea of community is actually very strong in the second speaker, Professor Yulan Chou's presentation. But in the case of Myanmar, I'm not too sure in the case of Thailand, maybe not as bad. The craft, it's actually very much active, right? And it's actually very difficult. The buildings are very complex to a certain extent that the community will be rather challenged to maintain themselves by themselves. There will be a need for master craftsmen master carpenters, highly skilled people in the maintenance. So Singapore is a very extreme situation. We are very unique and extreme. We do not have any crafts. And a very extreme situation. We don't have any craft left. And we have to rely on the imports of craft. And in the region, Southeast Asia, the state and status of craft is also on the decline, right? It's also on decline. So what will be the challenge specifically in Myanmar, in Indonesia, and of course in Thailand, on the promotion of craft? Well, on one hand, we can always argue that the government need to do something. That's an easy argument. But on the other hand, what are the ground activities, the community, are they doing something to promote the knowledge of craft and the protection and conservation and maintenance of their timber buildings? Well, it's a difficult question, I must say.
In case of Thailand, I think craftsmanship is maintained and educated by fine art department for the part of the government section. But in the private section, these duties belong to the contractor. This is very strange. And the contractor, I think his first priority is money. It's not fine or correct craftsmanship. So, in the big picture in Thailand, I think we are able to maintain the good craftsmanship for some good building. Good building means it belongs to elite or powerful person or rich person. But on the other hand, the rest of the buildings that have less significance, quality, are left alone. I cannot see any strength of the community to promote the good craftsmanship. Because now Thailand, as well as Singapore, Indonesia, and as Myanmar, they are occupied by the power of capitalists, which everything belongs to business and money, profit. If they do conservation work, it means they must have profit. And profits and goodwill and cultural aspect, spiritual aspect, historical values doesn't come together. I hope this answer.
Well, one of the things that we have seen and we feel is important for people to recognize in Myanmar is that it's amazing how the spirit of craftsmanship still exists there after the oppression that they have endured. And one of the things that I think often we lose track of when we're trying to look at this from a professional level or from a builder's perspective as a contractor, is that we tend to lose track of the fact that much of the focus, if these buildings are going to continue to be serviceable, usable buildings, has to be placed on stewardship. It's very important that the people themselves be empowered to understand that it is their stewardship that's actually going to keep these buildings and these crafts alive. And what we have found is that in the case of our carpenters that we work with in Myanmar, and of course it's only been 3 years of much learning to be done yet, But when the project first started and we were given carpenters to work with, they were used to being employed in a, as you were saying, a situation where the government is paying for it and the contractor is making the money, and the focus tends to be on the capitalist perspective that's there, rather than on necessarily even the quality of the craftsmanship. Oftentimes it's more a matter of how much money they're willing to spend to get something done. And so the background that the tradespeople had that we were working with was somewhat skewed because they really weren't used to working in an environment where they were being asked to do their best work. Instead, they typically were asked just to get something done as inexpensively as possible and make it look like they've been told it's supposed to look. But when we do give those tradespeople the ability to actually express themselves and to begin to learn the things that we've been trying to teach them, like the traditional locking joint that I showed in my, which is a Kongbong period joint that has fallen out of use. But if you're restoring a Kongbong period building, you need to learn how to use that. And the traditional scarf joint. And as the craftsmen, as the carpenters began doing that work, the first thing that you saw from them was a lack of surety because they weren't sure how to express themselves in a way that didn't make it appear as though they were trying to tell anyone this is the right or wrong way to do things, because they had been told this is not how this works. You're told what's the right or wrong way to do things. But now what we've found is that being given the ability to use the tools, being given the ability to work with the traditional joinery, now they are beginning to express themselves, and they're actually showing us that they have skill levels that are much higher than we ever could have expected. It's just that they don't have the opportunity to use them. And so I think if we're going to look at this on a big picture, not only do we need to empower the tradespeople, but we need to empower the communities that they're working for to realize that they are part of the picture. It is not just the professionals. It is not just the government. It is all of us together. The community extends so that once we have accomplished what we want to accomplish, it will be revered, it will be considered to be of value, and it will be taken care of by the community. And I'm talking about both the buildings and the trades themselves.
Yeah, if we discuss about the building conservation, we just take a look and focus on the building only. So we just neglect about the occupant, about the local people, about the human itself. So from the example that I show you before from the 3 small sample from Indonesia. So this is this is include non-engineered building. If we would like to make some governmental bidding, this is not make sense. This is out of date about the bidding, because this is not standard. We have some experience and something like that. And for example, in South Solo in Sumatra, we have some project 1,000 rumah gadang, 1,000 gadang house, the big house. So, but we have no support from the carpenters, from the artisan, because artisan and carpenters, they cannot live, because no work, because no activity, no job, because now maybe not only in timber material, not become concrete, steel, and something like that. So this is just like ring off the that way. And from the public servants, I think we need to distribute the appropriate responsibility. Which part can take about from the public servant. This is not only providing, but enabling. And enabling local people, enabling common people to invite join with our program, join with our conservation. And this is not only one or two institutions. This is belonging by nation, belonging by the worldwide heritage. So this one, I think we need to put entry in the education curriculum also, and maybe some ports, special ports, and also I agree what kind of the Department of Conservation. Thank you.
Can I answer that question a little bit? I think it's not all lost. If you talk about capitalist society as in Hong Kong, we were involved in about 20 buildings that are sort of in the villages, sort of timber buildings, and some of them can be as old as 150 years to about 110 years. We were able to train up a group of craftsmen belonging to the contractor. So the contractor has groups of craftsmen to do the project. So if there are enough projects, this were funded by the government with our specification, with our own, with our research, and therefore the sort of proper way of making or renovating the buildings. A small group of craftsmen were able to be trained, and they have projects all throughout the years. And that's one way to keep up the system maybe, and also to keep up the training and keep up the skill, and so they can continue to work on, we have a lot of maybe about 4,000 or 5,000 wooden buildings still to be preserved, and so that's, if the governments continue to give us money for preservation, that would be possible to have the craftsmen. The other experience I had was with the Tibet Heritage Fund, train up more than 100, 200 craftsmen to work from project to projects from scratch. So they were not interested before, but was able to train it up, and the community can go with it. Unfortunately, they have to be pushed out of Tibet and now working in Ladakh, but still the same way of training. And I think that is possible. So should not be too negative about that. Yeah.
Yes, I also agree that all is not doom. I think that in crisis, we learn that what have we done is not correct. And once we realize that what we have done is not correct, then there's an opportunity to change things. And I'm always very positive about that. With that, I would like to open the floor for questions. And please take the opportunity to ask our three distinguished speakers some questions. Well, I think about okay, Lawrence.
Hi. Yeah. Is it okay?
Yes.
Right. So I agree with the idea that in terms of traditional crafts, there needs to be kind of some creative thinking about how to sustain it, because in the past it's through patronage and it's through very kind of wealthy patrons like the kings and the royalties and so on, which we are not on the same level today. So the kind of patronage has to shift, and perhaps it has to be a bit more diffused, right? So through government channels, through maybe even commercial ventures and education. But what I'm actually more concerned with is the transmission of that knowledge over time. So it's not just the once-off or continuing patronage, but if there's no transmission from, say, the master to the student and so on, then eventually it will still go off, die off. So education is one way, but I think in traditional crafts, the idea of kind of schooling, academic studies is sort of like non-existent. So we, traditional craftsmen learn through making. So how do we, I don't know, maybe through the experience of the three speakers, how do you see this transmission happening, say, beyond 1 or 2 generations? Because so we're not just talking about next 5 years, but I'm more interested in the next 50 years, perhaps, if you want to see a regeneration of these crafts. And the other thing I'm also concerned about is also, say, this community effort to sustain the transmission and the, whatever knowledge. If the community values change, then obviously the priority will be different. So what we might see is then a shift away from these traditional crafts. So I think the Indonesian, Dr. Yulanto's presentation was very interesting because some of these festivals and rituals are still very much geared towards each community's own belief systems. But I'm also wondering if, let's say, there is this trend towards a more Islamic outlook in the whole entire Indonesia, would these local cultures be seen as perhaps even taboo, and therefore it will slowly die out? And therefore it might then impact on how some of these traditional structures might be regenerated. So those are the two questions that I have. Thanks.
Yeah. So actually, if we counting about the financial, so the last video that I saw you before, this is CSR, not mean corporate social responsibility, no, but cultural social responsibility. So we gather fund and something like that from the corporate, from the NGO and something like that, and we did some program, cultural social responsibility. So this is we invite, we encourage public contribution. So that you see upon the, so this one is, in Sumba, they believe Marapu. Marapu is local religion. So we have maybe more than 10 or 20 local religion in Indonesia. Besides the 5 legal religion, Catholic, Christian, Islam, Buddhist, Hindus, and Konghucu. But this one is Marapu in Sumba. And in Toraja, Talu Adolo. This is a different religion also. But we can see clearly the ancestor to conserve about the building, not only a price, not only a monk, not only monk to do the conservation, but encourage, but invite the public contribution, invite the funding from the local people. So this why we call it, we can maintain this one not only in legal procedure, but maybe in cultural way. Yeah, thank you.
So there's another question on the sustainability and the transmission of knowledge. Would any one of 3 speakers would like to answer this question?
Obviously, I can't speak for the parts of the world that you work, but I think that in Myanmar, they're actually in a very good position right now. I think that the fact that the country was closed for so long and that so little attention was paid to the historic structures, that I think that the public is actually yearning to see something done to preserve these historic buildings. We find that when we're working at Shuizhong, people come and are very excited to find out that something's being done to take care of this building. Much different than when people from the government come. They act like we had no idea what we're doing and we've just done something horrible to their building. But the people come and they are quite excited about what's happening. So I think, just speaking for Myanmar, I think Myanmar is in a very good position right now because there still are a lot of wooden buildings that have survived, and there's a great need for the traditional skills that it needs to take care of them. So I can't speak for 2 decades down the road. That's a little long for me to even envision that. But I would say that easily for at least another decade or longer, teaching traditional trades would not only have great significance, but it would also employ a lot of people who would like to have gainful and good employment. And one of the things about the people of Myanmar that I have noticed personally is that even though capitalism is taking over inevitably, there's nothing to do that we can do to stop that, yet they still are more focused on the joy that comes from everyday life. I've met very few people in Myanmar who are thinking in a capitalist way. They still have their cultural values that I think would would mean that those people who do get trained in traditional trades would be able to be a very important part of the culture. And I think that's one of the things that we need to realize is one of the things that capitalism tends to do, in my opinion, is it tends to devalue the position of the tradesperson in society. And that's something that's an unnecessary evil in my opinion, but it's something that something can be done about. So I think in Myanmar there's a perfect opportunity to see that paradigm turned on its head, at least for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. Is there any questions for our speakers? Well, maybe we'll enjoy talking to them individually over lunch. We have prepared a very simple vegetarian lunch outside, and the session will reconvene itself at 1 p.m. Please join us to thank our 3 distinguished speakers and our 2 discussants for the morning session. Thank you. And a little bit of advertisement for the afternoon session. The afternoon session will be continuing the discussion of timber, but more specifically on the modern challenges of timber through conservation science techniques, and that would probably address the issues, a specific case in Singapore whereby we have very little crafts left, and perhaps that it's a one way out into positive solutions and creative challenge in the conservation of timber. Thank you very much, and I'll see you and have a good chat over lunch, and I'll see you at 1 o'clock. Thank you.